The storm came without warning. The night was supposed to be quiet in the small town nestled deep in the mountains. Snowflakes had begun to fall gently in the late afternoon, the kind of snowfall that makes children run outside with wide eyes and neighbors smile at one another. But by evening, the flakes thickened, the wind howled, and the storm grew into something fierce. The roads became treacherous, cars slid helplessly into ditches, and the once calm little town found itself swallowed in blizzard-white chaos. On the edge of that town lived an old widow named Margaret. Her house stood alone, a cozy but weathered farmhouse with peeling white paint and smoke that curled warmly from the chimney. Margaret was well known by her neighbors as the kind of woman who never passed by anyone in need. Her late husband, Charles, had been a biker in his younger days. Together, decades earlier, they'd ridden across states on the back of his Harley. But those days had faded, leaving only photographs and memories. Now, she lived quietly, filling her days with knitting, baking pies, and feeding the stray cats that always seemed to find her porch. That night, as the storm raged, Margaret heard a strange sound over the howling wind, a low, rumbling thunder. It wasn't thunder at all but the sound of motorcycles. She frowned, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and peeked out the frosted window. Headlights flickered in the swirling snow. Dark figures struggled to steer their bikes against the wind. 15 of them. Bikers. They stopped on the road in front of her house, clearly lost, freezing, and desperate. She could see them through the blur of snow, leather jackets stiff with frost, hands trembling, faces red from the cold. Most people might have locked their doors. After all, 15 bikers on motorcycles, covered in tattoos and looking rough around the edges, was not a sight that brought comfort to strangers. But Margaret did not hesitate. She pulled her boots on, opened her door, and waved her arms. "Over here," she shouted through the storm. "Don't just stand there, you'll freeze to death." The bikers looked at one another, surprised. They weren't used to such welcomes. But the leader, a tall man with a beard speckled white from snow, nodded, and they all followed Margaret inside. The warmth of her home hit them like a miracle. She hurried them to take off their soaked gloves and boots, setting towels by the fireplace. She brought out blankets, laid out steaming mugs of cocoa, and even pulled fresh bread from the oven. The bikers, hardened men who looked like they had spent their lives on rough roads, sat quietly, humbled by the kindness of a tiny old woman who treated them as though they were her own sons. That night, the storm raged on. The power flickered once and went out. But Margaret lit oil lamps, humming softly as she moved about her kitchen. The bikers sat in a circle, sharing stories with her, laughing like boys. Slowly, they opened up. Their leader, who introduced himself as Jack, explained that they were on a long ride to honor a fallen friend. They had been caught off guard by the storm, miles away from the nearest motel. Margaret listened with tears in her eyes, telling them of her own Charles, how he used to ride, how she missed the roar of his bike pulling into the driveway. Something shifted in that small living room that night. 15 bikers who had expected only cold shoulders and suspicion found themselves wrapped in warmth and love. Margaret, who had been alone for years, found her house full again, filled with laughter, the smell of leather and snow, and the echoes of her husband's spirit. When morning came, the storm had passed. The bikers stepped outside to find the roads plowed, the sky a brilliant blue. But when Jack turned to thank Margaret, he noticed something unusual. Lined up outside her home, across the road, on the sidewalks, even stretching into the distance, were motorcycles. Not 15, not 20, but nearly 100. Word had spread. During the night, as the bikers had messaged their brothers and friends about the kindness of the widow who had sheltered them, more riders had come. They rode through the night, braving the snow, just to meet the woman who had opened her home and her heart without hesitation. Margaret stepped onto her porch, her eyes wide with disbelief. The rumble of engines was deafening, but the sight was even more powerful. Hundreds of men and women, all dressed in leather and chains, all hardened by life on the road, sitting astride their bikes, silent and reverent. Then, as if on cue, they removed their helmets. Faces young and old, scarred and worn, turned toward her. Jack stepped forward and spoke. "Last night, you reminded us of something we'd forgotten, that no matter how tough life gets, kindness still exists. You gave us warmth when the world was cold. You gave us a home when we had none. And today, we want you to know that you're not alone either. Your family now." Margaret's lips trembled. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face as the bikers cheered. They promised to check on her, to fix her house when it needed repairs, to keep her safe in a world that often forgot the elderly. That winter morning, a woman who had once sat alone in silence found herself surrounded by family, hundreds of strong, loyal souls who would never forget her kindness. From then on, Margaret's home was never empty. Bikers came by regularly, helping with chores, bringing her groceries, and listening to her stories. Every year, on the anniversary of that storm, hundreds of bikes lined up outside her house once more, not because they had to, but because love and loyalty demanded it. And so, a widow who once thought her best years were behind her became the beating heart of an unlikely family. All because, on one snowy night, she opened her door.